Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And it is time for a starter pack, a Southern hip hop starter pack. I'm sorry it's been a while since I've done a starter pack, but it took me a while to pull this one together and write up a bunch of bullet points of things that I wanted to say about each album. And I had to pare down a lot of records because the South is a very large region. It covers a lot of ground. And it covers a lot of sounds. It covers a lot of styles. And there are some artists even in this starter pack that I didn't even end up covering. I had to cut a lot of records. I had to cut like 5 or 6 records out of this thing because it just would have been too long. And even so, at the point where it is now, I have like 11 releases on this list. So this is easily the biggest starter pack that I've done so far. But still, we do cover a lot of records, and we don't even really get that much into newer stuff. You know, I mostly pick some older releases to, I guess, kind of give you guys a better idea as to how we progress to where we are at the moment, because there's really kind of no shortage of attention on contemporary Southern rap and artists who are not even in the South but want to sound like they have a Southern sound. So, all right, let's get into it, because again, a lot of ground and a lot of records to cover over here to start. And I'm going to be reading off a lot of the bullet points that I read myself, so I try to get, to everything about each release that I thought was worth talking about. First, 8Ball and MJG's On Top of the World, 1995 record. Not the most Southern sounding release. Like, sure, these guys are godfathers of a lot of sounds that would become popular a little bit down the road, or were popular at the time in the South. But you could definitely hear like that G-funk, that West Coast influence coming up a little bit in their music, which is not that surprising given just how immensely popular artists like Tupac and Dr. Dre were at the time. So again, that's not surprising. What really kind of makes this album special and excellent is just how good each song is, how catchy each track is, how smooth and well-oiled and incredibly well assembled all the songs on this project are. Even if it is a tad sort of bloated and overloaded, 8Ball and MJG lyrically, as far as their flows went as well, at this point in their career, I feel like they were rivaling other duos in the region like UGK and OutKast. However, they just didn't have that long game that those artists did, which really ended up kind of working against, I think, their long-term popularity. Obviously, when it comes to Southern groups, they are one of the first that gets mentioned. They are one of the first that you think of, but it's just... Excuse me. It's just a shame that they didn't have the sort of consistent discography that some of their more, mainstream contemporaries did. But still, again, lyrics on this thing are pretty solid. A lot of tracks that, sure, while they do deal in drug dealing and drugs, you are kind of getting a grittier and more vivid and grim picture of that lifestyle. And a lot of thoughtful tracks and... again, just great chemistry and vocal performances from these guys. Just a good all-around album. Next, I wanted to recommend Ghetto Boys. Grip It. I can't talk right now. Excuse me. Nope, skipped ahead. On that other level, Ghetto Boys, Houston outfit. This is a 1989 album, I believe. Guys like Bushwick Bill and Scarface are part of the reason the Ghetto Boys just had this incredibly wild energy and sound. I didn't put any solo Scarface on this list. That was one of the records that was like, oh, should I put it on? Should I not? But I figured since I'm already mentioning Scarface here, if you like this record, if you are more curious about him and his work, do check out The Diary. Excellent album, and an even better record than this, but still I wanted to mention and bring this record up because this is another early Southern release, another early Southern classic. So as a result of this record dropping in 1989, what I guess we kind of see or understand as a more southern hip hop sound wasn't fully developed yet. So as a result, a lot of the rhythms, a lot of the beats, a lot of the samples, a lot of the breaks that you hear on this album are very similar to what you were probably hearing on East Coast records, West Coast records. I mean, there are even points on this album where it sounds like there's like a bit of a like Ice Cube-esque flow coming specifically from Willie D. Like there's a big NWA influence on this thing, but in some ways I feel like Ghetto Boys take it even more violent and crazier and just a little more over the top. Sure, while this is not, excuse me, I think as well put together or as developed or as popular as an album like We Can't Be Stopped, for example, which came a few years later. This album is still notable because it sort of shows that the early days of Southern hip hop was sort of born out of the same almost national consciousness of hip hop, that same stylistic petri dish that a lot of artists in the 80s were. You know, it took a while for the regions that we know of in hip hop music to sort of separate and sort of totally generate their completely different sounds and styles and vibes that we sort of know them for today in the 90s and the 2000s. So it did take quite a while because, again, in the early days, like a lot of hip hop artists sounded very much the same. In terms of like influences and stuff, because New York was the place that a lot of people were looking to for that inspiration. Man, I just can't get over this cough right now. And I wasn't even coughing before I shot this video. All right, let's get into the next one. Goodie Mob, Soul Food. Oh, excellent album. Excellent record. This is an Atlanta record, Atlanta quartet. If you're not familiar with Goodie Mob, you sure fucking should be. You know, it sort of sucks that that not as many people know about Goodie Mob, despite the fact that they have so many deep connections with OutKast. But whatever. To me, Goodie Mob was one of the most versatile and creative and eccentric and unique rap groups in the South. A lot of production from Organized Noise, who, if you are an OutKast fan, you should already be familiar with. Very, very, if I didn't already say, very mystical, very out there sound. You can tell from some of the gritty lyrics and the very tight flows on this album that there was definitely a bit of a East Coast hardcore hip hop influence in what they were doing. However, they came to a completely different creative conclusion with the music on this album. Bit of a recommendation if anybody's making a Mother's Day mix this year. Feel free to throw on the song "Guess Who." That should get your mom catching some feelings. but between CeeLo, who obviously got his start, I believe, in this group, Cujo, Big Gip, Timo, like they had so much talent at their disposal, so many bases covered. And so many different personalities and colors sort of coming through on the microphone and in the music too. So Goodie Mob, easily one of the most creative albums, soul food, to come out of Atlanta and in the 90s. And I guess I'll just kind of leave it at that because if I were to get specifically into a lot of songs here, we could probably just do a review, and that's not what we're doing. Next, Juvenile, 400 Degreez. I laugh at this album cover every time I see it. This dude's from New Orleans. Cash Money Records release. You can't really talk about Southern hip hop without at least mentioning Cash Money Records. This is easily one of the more solid releases to drop on the label at the time. It's a little all over the place stylistically and instrumentally. Some of the instrumentals are kind of rickety and sound like a little, at least for the time, a little low budget. However, there is a bit of character to this record because of that. And also, like Juvenile, what really sells the album is just his husky, expressive voice. You have tracks on here that are super like smooth, catchy trunk knockers. Other tracks that are gritty and more murderous, like the track UPT. While the album is rudimentary, it does kind of have that very specific Southern charm to it. I'll say that. And It's sort of odd thinking of this record coming out in 1998. It sounds like it came out in like 1993 or 4 or something. But still, well, although I guess this was sort of the, I'm not going to doubt myself there and sort of get into a bunch of digressions on this album. But I do recommend it. It's got a lot of character to it. It's a lot of fun. Next one, I think some people might have a hard time swallowing, but I do feel like it was a moment when a lot of people were looking at the South. So as a result, I had to kind of add it. Little John and the East Side Boys, Kings of Crunk. Yeah, crunk music is not necessarily an artistic high point for Southern rap, I guess you could say. However, I do feel like in some ways this is a precursor to a lot of the loud, bassy, banging, lyrically repetitive SoundCloud rap that we have today. And again, Little John had his moment in the sun. He had his 15 minutes of fame, and he certainly made his mark really hard in that 15 minutes. Not only with just how aggressive his production was, but again, with how in such a quick amount of time, this whole crunk thing really took hip hop by storm, but also transcended the genre itself. Like Little John was almost like a folk hero in the popular music world. Like there were even, kids that didn't even really listen to rap that closely, and they knew who the hell Little John was, not only because of just how colorful of a figure he was, but the production he was doing for other artists such as Usher and just the attention he was demanding in hip hop itself because of the sound he was bringing. So you can't really ignore Little John completely. You can't really ignore Crunk. You can't really ignore Little John. It was a short-lived thing because it is a very basic thing. It's not it's very loud. Like I said, it's very repetitive. It's very to the point. However, I enjoy it quite a bit. And I remember quite a few people talking about Crunk at the time as like, oh, this is like punk music for hip hop right now. Which I mean, I didn't quite get at the time, but it is a very aggressive, basic, to the point sound, and I personally fucking love blasting the shit out of this album when I was going to school at the time. So let's move on to the next one. OutKast, Aquemini, a duo that really kind of needs no introduction at this point. Like, even if you're not a huge hip-hop fan, you probably have heard of OutKast. You probably have heard of Andre 3000. And if you're going to get into their stuff or get a taste for the Southern sound, or I guess a Southern sound, because there's a lot of different sounds, you're going to want to try this album, because records like this, artists like OutKast, to me, exemplify just how ripe with experimentation a lot of the South, and specifically Atlanta, has always been. To think of some of the artists coming out of Atlanta in the early 90s, and then we get to Aquemini, and then we get to like what's going on now with the whole new Atlanta thing with Future and Migos and so on and so forth. Like it's a really crazy progression to sort of think of it in that way. Whereas like if you take what's been going on in New York and sort of what are more New York specific sounds, like from the 80s to like the bling era, the transition to me isn't quite as crazy, but still a transition to be noted. But yeah, listen to Aquemini. It's an excellent album. Great lyrics, great flows, amazing instrumentals, very thoughtful album too, and a very experimental for hip hop as well. Another group that really kind of needs no introduction, and a record that really needs no introduction. Like most people, because of SoundCloud rap and the current day of trap music, probably are familiar with this project. But if you're not, please do listen to it. Like a lot of the very dark, demonic, eerie, freaky, scary, almost like goth side of hip hop music that you hear today, like is so deeply indebted to this album. It cannot be overstated. It cannot be overstressed. Like I feel like you wouldn't have a Space Ghost Perp or an ASAP Rocky or a Bones or, you know, in some ways, even like a Little Peep without what 3 6 Mafia did. I don't know if there's much more for me to say about this record other than that. You know, even Travis Scott is hugely indebted to this record. It's just really raw. It's really grimy. You know, it's not quite as well assembled and smooth as like Aquemini or 8Ball and MJG or anything like that. You know, do go into this expecting kind of a rough listen. However, it adds to the grittiness and the murderous evil quality of this album. And, you know, again, to think of 3 6 Mafia's name, 3 6 666, you know, obvious reference to dark powers and Satan and Satanism there. Like that's not something that you typically get out of hip hop music around this time frame, you know, which is another reason that 3 6 Mafia were so ahead of their time and so unique. So please do listen to Mystic Stylez if you do listen to any of the bigger projects on this list. You know, I mean, I love the Juvenile. I love the Little John. I love the fucking Ghetto Boys album. But still, if you have to try anything in this list, do try this one out. You know, if you're in a rush or whatever, you know, definitely make sure you give this one a shot. Don't let this slip by you. T.I. Trap Music, 2000s album. This might be the most contemporary album in the whole list. No, I mean the Little John record's pretty contemporary, so that's not the only album in the list that's relatively new. But still, this album isn't too old. It's it's like 15 years old at this point, right? Isn't it? It's like 15 years old, but still, T.I. pretty much the godfather of trap music. Even though the music he was making at the time doesn't sound anything like trap music today. Sure, he had a pretty distinctly Southern sound, especially coming from his vocals and his flows, but I guess if the spirit of trap music is here, it is in the narrative of the album, which obviously, I mean, if you've listened to trap music today, which you have, you pretty much know what he's rapping about here. Although I'll say that T.I.'s approach in the early 2000s with the subject matter was much more thoughtful, much more grim, much more true to life, much more lyrical. Yeah, I mean, this is easily one of T.I.'s most lyrical projects. So some really catchy tracks on here too. Some of the production just reads sort of like your average Bling era sort of instrumental, but still, it's a very good release. And you know, if you consider yourself a fan of this style, you cannot go on with like having not heard this album. All right, let's close out that because I'm getting texts and I'm still finishing up this video. UGK Ridin Dirty, another duo that doesn't really need any introduction. Bun B, Pimp C, excellent duo, excellent energy, excellent chemistry. Sure, this album isn't quite as well assembled as some of the 2000s stuff they would release, but still, their energy and I guess the raw fashion that this album was recorded and written in, I think, is to its credit. And you know, Bun B and Pimp C bring so much swagger and personality on the microphone. Sure, it's not super deep or anything like that, but like a lot of Southern hip hop, like it's so much about the vibe. It's about the swagger. It's about the hooks. It's about just I guess just the charisma, which there's a certain kind of, I don't know, like a laid back, I'm not exactly sure what the word is I'm trying to look for here, but you know, the kind of charisma you get from a lot of the Southern rappers that came up in the same era that UGK did. It's a very specific thing, and UGK is a prime example of it. And we're gonna move on to the last one over here, which is a various artists compilation, Down South Hustlers, Bouncin' and Swingin', which is a No Limit compilation, Master P's label. You can't really talk about Southern hip hop without at least giving a nod to No Limit Records. This is like a mid '90s release, and There's appearances on here from, of course, Master P, Skullduggery, C Murders, Silk the Shocker, and a lot of other people who it essentially gives a wide and very large picture of the scene and the landscape at the time, even if a lot of the artists on the compilation aren't specifically or strictly Southern artists. No Limit was huge at the time. No Limit was fucking huge. And obviously, if you go into the catalog of the label, you're going to see a certain type of, I guess, album cover art, which still very much resonates and is very popular to this day. Like, tons of artists have ripped off the very gaudy, ridiculous, over-the-top photoshops that tend to populate the No Limit catalog. But yeah, again, it's a various artist compilation. It gives you a good picture of the type of sound that No Limit was bringing to the table, which was deeply influential in the region at the time. And that is pretty much it. I mean, this is a very long video. I mean, I didn't say as much about some of these albums as I think I would have liked to if I was doing a review, but still, it was a lot of projects and it was a lot to go over. So hopefully you guys got something out of it. Hopefully you guys got into some of the recommendations here. They are all listed down there in the description. And that's going to be it, guys. Anthony Fantano, Starter Pack Forever.